The Battle of the Bulge, or the Ardennes Offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, and was one of the last major German offensives of the Second World War. Although the Germans had gotten off to a strong start, the resulting battle dealt severe blows to the country's armoured forces and saw the loss of between 63,000 and over 100,000 troops. It is considered the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States during World War II, and the third deadliest campaign in US history. Today we are looking at the Battle of the Bulge. Welcome to Wars of the World. By late 1944, Allied powers were feeling confident that after a grueling 5-year conflict, the end of World War II was drawing near. In the last 4 months, they'd gained ground and secured sweeping victories, and in mid-December, even US General Dwight D. Eisenhower had allowed himself a little relaxation and hopefulness. Meanwhile, over in Germany, Adolf Hitler was planning a comeback. On December 16th, Allied military officials began receiving reports that there was enemy activity occurring in a 75-mile stretch of densely wooded hills and valleys of the Ardennes, an area in Belgium and Luxembourg. According to History.com, Hitler's very own trusted lieutenants greatly disliked the plan for the Ardennes offensive, believing that the timeline required to pull it off was too tight and very ambitious, as he wanted his men to burst through Allied forces, cross the Meuse River, retake Brussels, and seize the port at Antwerp, all in just a few days. Though many cautioned Hitler about the unreasonable timeline he'd be putting upon his soldiers, he ignored them all. German Field Marshal Walter Model later told his subordinates that the plan, quote, hasn't got a damn leg to stand on, and has no more than a 10% chance of success, end quote. Another Field Marshal, Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled being staggered, adding, quote, it was obvious to me that the available forces were far too small. In fact, no soldier really believed that the aim of reaching Antwerp was really practicable. But I knew by now that it was useless to protest to Hitler about the possibility of anything, end quote. Hitler's right-hand men failed to persuade him to send in a smaller pool of German troops, so instead hundreds of troops were dispatched to the eastern edge of the Ardennes, where they assembled out of the eye line of Allied air surveillance. The generals Sepp Dietrich and Hasso von Manteuffel were in charge of 28 divisions, 10 of which were armoured and involved over 1,200 tanks, despite there being a distinct lack of fuel available. German leaders had hoped that they'd be able to procure fuel from the Americans if the offensive was successful, but little did they know that chronic shortages would soon pose a problem for them. Due to abysmal road conditions and poorly thought out plans, much of the 5 million gallons of fuel set aside did not reach those who needed it. And at one point, several German army divisions resorted to using horses to travel. Allied forces eventually began destroying or evacuating their own fuel supplies to avoid it falling into the hands of the Germans, and by Christmas time, the German tanks had very little left to run on. The German attack on December 16th was so swift and sudden that it caught Allied forces off guard, and allowed Hitler's men to easily break through the front. Not only were they blindsided, but they were completely outnumbered, with the number of US forces in the Ardennes being very limited, especially compared to the 200,000 German soldiers on the ground. Historian Martin King noted, quote, in December of 1944, there were only 4 American divisions in the Ardennes covering an 89-mile front. 2 of the divisions had never fired a shot in anger, and 2 were recovering from the grueling battle of Hürtgen Forest, end quote. The Battle of the Bulge began at 5:30 AM, with the first blow coming hard and fast, landing on the US 2nd, 99th, 106th, and 28th Divisions. Veterans recalled seeing eerie coloured lights emerging through the fog, while the terrifying groans of Nebelwerfer rockets and other thunderous detonations sounded. Within 24 hours, German tanks had broken through the Allied forces and moved westward to the Meuse River, running through Belgium. This movement led to the disruption of the line of Allied forces, giving the battle its odd name. Just one day after the assault had begun, German soldiers captured 125 men and killed 86 of them in what is known as the Malmedy Massacre. A similarly callous but much smaller massacre occurred in Wereth, Belgium, that same day when 11 black American soldiers were captured after surrendering and were subsequently tortured. They were eventually shot to death by men of the 1st SS Panzer Division, led by Major Gustav Nissel, and their frozen bodies were found 6 weeks later. During an examination of the bodies, it was found that each man had been brutally assaulted around their face, their legs broken by rifle butts, and some of their fingers had been cut off. Others had been stabbed with bayonets, while at least one had been shot whilst bandaging the wounds of a comrade. Nittel was one of the men found responsible for the Malmedy massacre. He was sentenced to life in prison for ordering illegal executions of American POWs during the Battle of the Bulge. However, his sentence was reduced to 15 and then to 12 years. He was released from prison in 1953 and eventually died in 1976. For much of the war, the Allies had made moves according to the intelligence provided by Ultra, a British unit specializing in decrypting Nazi radio transmissions. However, Germans often talked by phone when within their own borders. Adding to this was the fact that while US officials learned of German activity in the area, these reports were largely dismissed, as many didn't believe that an attack would be carried out in such difficult terrain and weather conditions. But the assault was strategically planned, and Hitler was in fact counting on the poor weather to make the battle all the more difficult. Troops were subjected to freezing temperatures, heavy rain and snowfall, and thick clouds of fog. Over 15,000 cases of cold injuries, including trench foot, frostbite and pneumonia, were reported over the winter, with veteran Warren Spahn recalling, quote, "I was from Buffalo, I thought I knew cold, but I didn't really know cold until the Battle of the Bulge." End quote. But it wasn't just the brutal weather conditions hindering the ability of Allied forces. The Germans also changed road signs to cause confusion, cut their telephone lines, and even sent in imposters, with one veteran, Vernon Brantley, remembering, quote, "We got word that the Germans had dropped a lot of paratroopers behind our lines, and that they were dressed like American soldiers, and that they spoke English." End quote. Reportedly, these Nazi troops had spent time with American POWs to help them adopt the English language and even American slang in what is known as Operation Griff, or Griffin in English. Upon learning of the infiltration, US soldiers started testing suspected Nazis by having them answer questions of American trivia. German soldiers who were rounded up by Allied powers were found guilty at a military tribunal and sentenced to death by firing squad. Perhaps one of the most tried units throughout this battle was the 106th Golden Lions Division, attempting to secure a difficult area named Schnee Eifel. The group's commander attempted to contact superior officers to request that his men be removed, as he felt that they were too exposed. But the bad weather had meant that the connection was poor, and the commander misinterpreted or misheard what he was told, so he believed he and his troops were to remain in position. Shortly afterwards, with no support, little ammunition, and under heavy attack, over 6,000 US troops surrendered, in what is considered one of the largest mass surrenders of US soldiers during World War II. 4 days into the offensive, US soldiers managed to scramble together to put a stop to the German advance on the northern shoulder, while in various other parts of the Ardennes, separate divisions, including the 7th Armoured Division, blocked the way of German troops. One of the biggest events in the Battle of the Bulge was the siege of Bastogne. On December 19th, senior Allied commanders met to discuss the fact that the Belgian town of Bastogne was under threat from the Germans. Bastogne was a key location during the Battle of the Bulge, due to it being a crossroad town through which all 7 of the main roads through the area of the Ardennes converged. If the Germans seized this town, they would be able to expand northwards. But if the Allies held it, they could reconquer areas recently overrun by the Germans. By December 21st, however, German forces had surrounded the town, which was defended by several units, including the 969th Artillery Battalion and the 101st Airborne Division. By all accounts, it was not an easy fight. Medical aid and personnel alike had been captured. Food was in short supply, and artillery ammunition was depleting by the day. Luckily, the weather had cleared the following day, meaning that supplies could be dropped in to help the troops. Though the attack was grueling, US soldiers continued to hold the perimeter, while the population within the city limits took refuge in shelters and cellars, fearing for their lives. Though German commanders demanded an immediate surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously responded with a typewritten letter which read, "Nuts." At this time, Lieutenant George Patton Jr. was in charge of the 3rd Army, consisting of around 230,000 soldiers, and he led his troops in what is described as a sharp 90 degrees in a counter-thrust movement, allowing him to break through German lines and enter the Belgium town on December 26th, pushing German soldiers east across the Rhine. Meanwhile, with the clearing of the weather, Allied forces were able to begin launching their own assaults on German supply points and roads that the enemy soldiers were using to travel. On December 23rd, devastating attacks began by the US and its allies against the Germans, with fighter aircraft leading bombing raids and other assaults. By Christmas Eve, the Germans had effectively been stopped in their tracks. They were low on fuel and ammunition, and their supply lines had been cut off thanks to the efforts of the Allied troops. At this point, General Manteuffel had recommended to Hitler that they cease their offensive and retreat to the West Wall, but this notion was rejected. Though this would have been a good opportunity for the Allied forces to take a strong and bold stance against the Germans, reportedly, disagreement among Allied commanders halted them from doing so. In the following days, the German 2nd Panzer Division was cut off at the River Meuse, and while the group attempted to break out twice, it failed to do so. Allied troops held their position at the Meuse. While the Germans had been discouraged from attempting to continue their offensive in this area, Hitler was not entirely deterred. In January 1945, the Germans launched 2 further operations, Operation Baseplate and Operation Northwind. During the former operation, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began attacking Allied airfields in the Low Countries, which consisted of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In the attacks, over 465 aircraft were damaged, while the Luftwaffe itself lost 277 planes to Allied forces, although some were taken down by German flak guns who were not told of the impending attack. Furthermore, the Germans sustained further losses at an airfield known as Y-29, in which 40 of their own aircraft were destroyed, in comparison to the US, who lost only 4. Meanwhile, Operation Northwind also began on January 1st. 2 German army divisions launched a huge assault against the 70-mile line of the 7th US Army, a division that had been stretched particularly thin during the Battle of the Bulge. Operation Northwind was the last major German offensive of World War II on the Western Front, and it proved initially to be very successful, with German troops weakening the 7th Army greatly and leaving it vulnerable. By January 15th, the unit's 6th Corps was fighting on 3 sides, and 6 days later, due to dwindling supplies, including food and ammunition, the 7th Army retreated to defensive positions. The offensive grew to a close on January 25th. Together, the 6th Corps and 7th Army suffered over 25,000 casualties. On January 3rd, following the last German offensive, the US 1st Army began its own counter-offensive. Between the 8th and the 16th, they attempted to corner German troops, but the Germans were able to make a clean and clever withdrawal that saw them escape the trap that had been set by US forces. Still, for 3 weeks, the fighting continued. On January 16th, the 1st and 3rd Armies captured the city of Houffalize. 6 days later, the German 6th Panzer Army left the area, though the 5th Panzer Army remained, and the following day, January 23rd, the Belgian city of St. Vith was recaptured by the Americans. The Battle of the Bulge drew to a close on January 28, 1945. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill described the battle as being, quote, "undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." End quote. According to the US Department of Defense, over 1 million Allied troops fought in the conflict. Around 19,000 of them were killed, over 47,000 were wounded, and another 23,000 were declared as missing. By comparison, as many as 100,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured, though some estimates are at the lower end, at around 65 to 75,000. Although the battle had initially allowed the German forces to gain some ground and win several victories, their success was short-lived, and their movements were stalled by Christmas. Historian Martin King reflected on the differences between the way the Germans and the US operated during this battle, observing, quote, "Talking to both American and German veterans, you realize how very different these two armies were in their methods and methodologies. The Americans had this incredible capacity to improvise, to think on the hop, and operate autonomously right down to the squad level. The Germans couldn't operate below the regimental level without written orders." End quote. While German efforts did prevent Allied forces from invading Germany, at least for a while, and inflicted a great amount of damage, the offensive is generally considered a failure of an operation. As well as losing a huge chunk of soldiers, Germany lost an abundance of materials and supplies that it just couldn't replace. So if the Allies attacked, it would be a massive struggle for them to maintain any sort of prolonged defense. US Army officer John Eisenhower wrote in 1969, quote, "The Ardennes campaign of 1944 to 45 was only one in a series of difficult engagements in the battle for Europe. Nevertheless, it can be said that the Ardennes campaign epitomized them all. For it was here that American and German combat soldiers met in a decisive struggle that broke the back of the Nazi war machine." End quote. Meanwhile, journalist Dave Roos put it succinctly in summing up the Battle of the Bulge as Hitler's ill-fated final gamble.